So I'm very happy to have you with me today, Cynthia Goytia, professor at Universidad Di Tella in Buenos Aires, and also the director of the research center there, the Centro de Investigación de Política Urbana y Vivienda, Housing and Urban Policy Research Center, and really one of the leading scholars on housing and land use regulations in Latin America. So I'm glad to have your wealth of knowledge to ask you a lot of questions about housing and land use regulation in Argentina. So I was thinking maybe if you wouldn't mind starting out by giving us an idea of housing policy in Argentina, the role of the government in housing, and kind of how people access housing there.
Okay, well, thank you for inviting me to join you in this conversation. You know, one of the first things that I have to mention about housing policy in Argentina is that we have a long history of housing deficit, which means that 32% of the population has some type of housing deficit, either quantitative deficit, people that don't have housing or living in a house which is not suitable for living, or qualitative deficit, people that don't have infrastructure, don't have all the things, good quality of materials in the house and that. So this is very important because it has been the same for years. It's the government tried to implement different types of housing policies, and all the time what we have is that the new supply does not cover the demand of new housing per year that is needed. So we have a very big challenge. I think it's a triple challenge. First, housing provision for the new households that form every year. Second, to cover the deficit that we have. And third, that to improve the stock or reverse cover the deficit in the stock of housing that becomes deteriorated over the years. And to do that, we are a federal government, so we have policies at the national level, but the states, as in US, have a lot of decision about that. So we have a federal system of housing policy. In part, there are some type of conditional grants to the allocated to the provinces or to the states, distributed to state governments to finance housing policy, and there are others that are very much centralized. So we have two tiers of housing, of public finance for housing. When we have a good if in a country that you have a good housing policy, you are going to have a menu of different types of policies that are focused on people who has very low affordability, and the institutions that you need for people for housing finance, for example, for people that have some kind of purchasing power to afford housing. But this has not happened in Argentina. Many times housing policy has been totally concentrated in what we say direct provision by the government. The government is construct, and this was very common in all the countries in Latin America in some decades. Governments were used to construct housing that was direct provision by the government, and the state was a main constructor of housing. Later, governments have started, and Argentina's government too, and very a few years ago, not so much time ago, to implement some type of supply-driven subsidy programs. To demand subsidy programs.
Right, like a rental assistance kind of program.
Yes. To buy. And one important
but it's down payment assistance.
One important thing is that one of the main problems of most housing policy in Latin America is that is much focused on home ownership.
Right.
You don't have, when we talk about affordable housing, we are not talking about rental housing. We are talking about home ownership.
Mm-hmm.
So
when, sorry to interrupt, so when in the direct provision model, this is like similar to Colombia or Brazil, where they're building housing and then giving it or selling it very inexpensively to households? It's not a public rental housing program.
Yes, they are selling house. But the difference with the Colombian program, for example, that they are doing right now is that they have huge, very good institutions of housing finance. They can finance by credits, by the what they say caja de compensación is something that that the social security is mixed with that, like in Mexico, for example.
Right.
So they have a very good institutions of housing finance. In many other countries and many years ago, and in Argentina until a few years ago too, you don't have that. You give the house, and government was not allowed, has not the capacity to recover you have to collect for the payments of the house. So it was a huge deficit.
Right. It's necessarily a very limited amount of housing you can supply. Right?
Yes. And this is a big problem, because also the capacity of the state to construct housing is also very limited. Not only in terms of money, but on resources, but also in terms of the capacity to make this happen. So that's why the housing deficit has been increased over many years. So other type of programs that are implemented is when you try to subsidize the interest rate and some type of implicit subsidies, which are not very good because distort the whole market. Well, so Argentina 10 years ago has started a housing finance program with support of World Bank and international organizations who like this type of programs very much. They were granting upfront demand subsidies for the purchase of new or used housing, which is quite very important. You don't have to buy the new housing. You can have a process of filtering down and people buying new houses by their own, by others buying the houses that filter down.
Right.
Okay.
And also it enables a better location. I mean, that's been a problem in Mexico, where you can only use your loan to buy a new house, and the new houses are all pretty far from the city center, and so that's
yes, I'm going to talk about that because cool. That's one of the main problems of type of programs. So besides despite having implemented a housing finance program, the stock of mortgage to GDP is quite very low in Argentina. Yeah. In Argentina it's very low. In Brazil it's a little greater. Chile has a very large stock of mortgage to GDP, and Panama also in Latin America. So, and only people very qualified, and only a few people can qualify for that. So you have a problem of targeting of the programs, and you also have the problem of land, where this housing is located. We did a lot of, I work in the impact evaluation of this program for the World Bank, and we found that people are worse off why moving to public housing, because the location, they have access to lower opportunities that they have when they live in other places which were more modest but were well located. So and this is has been very important in all Latin America, which is most most governments implement a housing policy without any regard to land policy. They put a lot of subsidies, and they support the credit market and everything, and because they have a lot of concerns about affordability, but the effect of this subsidy or credit is always an increase in demand for housing, an increase in demand for land. And since land use regulation many times is very strict, or land use regulation, or you have a fixed supply and you need to generate more land, more well located land to work for that. So the effect of this subsidy and credits most of the time is generalized increases in land and housing prices. And so it does not improve affordability. In fact, it reduces affordability instead of improving access to housing. And the interesting thing is who benefits from this type of huge subsidy programs or credit programs, because newcomers to the housing markets are going to face higher housing prices. Renters, if the market gets hot, renters are also going to pay higher rents. So all the money that these governments many times are investing in housing programs is capitalized in existing housing units, benefit homeowners, existing homeowners. Okay,
Right.
it's clear what I'm trying to explain.
Yeah.
So many times this is not the best way to use public resources, and perhaps we need to pay more attention to land. We need to pay more attention, and this is has been the same with Mia Casa, Mia Vida in Brazil, with the Mexican finance programs as well, with Chile too, and in Argentina too. So people are living very, very far away, where land is cheap and where the housing can be constructed. And this in fact is it's a very, very important and very serious situation that many countries in Latin America, including Argentina, have to face.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very important point, and in this course, actually, something that I emphasize a lot is kind of thinking about the scope of housing policy a little bit differently than traditionally people have done, right? So if most people think about housing policy, they think about finance or public housing provision, like the subsidy side as the whole picture, when really in most places, the planning, the regulations, the local government capacity to provide infrastructure is as important or more important maybe than any kind of subsidy program. So
yes, you're right. You're right. And I think not many governments in Latin America have understand that. I
mean, there is also a challenge though, because it's often a national, like you're saying, the levels of government matter, right? And since the local government is responsible usually for infrastructure and land use regulation, they have maybe a different set of priorities than the national government. And the national government can do housing finance more easily than they can force local governments to provide infrastructure and plan slightly differently. But I think, I mean, I don't know if in Argentina, but I think there is an interesting trend of some kind of supervision of local planning, closer scrutiny or kind of centralization a little bit, efforts at centralization by national or federal governments because of these issues. I don't know if that's happened in Argentina.
Yes, I think
the federal government telling cities, you have to slightly change your infrastructure provision or your planning regulations.
Yes, I think that when you see how housing policy fail many times because of this, governments are just starting to understand that they need to take attention, to put more attention on that. But you have another problem. You have another problem, no? Because when we go to planning and how to provide and land use regulation and how to provide infrastructure at the local level, you see that many times planners take decisions without knowing what will be the impacts of their decisions. No?
Mm-hmm.
So there are many unintended effects of that planners fail to anticipate. And
Right.
plans are many times more rhetoric than instrumental.
Mm-hmm.
No? They have a lot of good wishes, or we want this, we want a sustainable city, big plots, a lot of green space and everything. We want everything, but this perhaps makes land less affordable.
Yeah.
Or perhaps they cannot enforce it at all. So,
right.
And most of the times, something that is very important in many Latin American countries is that they work on zoning, but they don't have management tools
Mm-hmm.
to finance infrastructure, like land-based tools or something like that.
Right.
So, and here is something very interesting that we are seeing right now in Argentina and in other countries. Governments are just understanding that every time that they change zoning, they change their plans in the city, they allow higher densities or higher FAR, they are generating value. They are bringing value to existing landowners. So in times when you need to finance infrastructure and many other things, what we are seeing in many more progressive local governments is, they are implementing some type of land value capture tools in order to capture some type of resources to finance infrastructure and services. So this has been a change in Argentina. Many other countries in Latin America has been implementing, like Brazil or Colombia, have a more long history of trying to do that. But you can see this now in Argentina. In fact, for example, the city of Buenos Aires now is trying to capture all the value generated by increases in FAR in the whole city to finance a housing program, to give credit for a housing program. So
that's great.
And this is something that is starting to happen even more in Argentina as well.
Yeah, so that sounds super interesting. I want to just took a note to read up on that program. That's something that sort of is happening here in LA. Some cities in LA, well, one at least, is having a transfer tax on housing and real estate in order to fund affordable housing, which seems like a great idea. But first, I want to ask you about land use regulations. But first, I just wanted to go back. You mentioned the housing challenges of Argentina being present for a long time. And it's interesting, I think in the class, and I wanted to check what you think about this. I think within Latin America, there is an idea that Argentina, and a reality that in compared to many countries, it is higher resources and kind of higher quality of life. And I wonder what you think about that and kind of the perception of Argentina maybe versus the reality that people might have.
Okay, I think that these things are dynamic over time. So Argentina has very well laid out cities. Cities are nice and have many amenities and everything. But it's incredible that a middle income country has so many housing deficit. And the other thing is that cities are growing without, you can find, the city is one city when you are in the city center or in the old areas of the city or the wealthiest areas of the city, but you have huge peripheries without infrastructure, with a lot of informal housing, without transport infrastructure. So I think there is this dichotomy between you have a lot of informal markets too in
Right. Yeah.
cities.
And I mean, that's something that many people might not realize. And so maybe we can talk about land use regulation specifically. I wonder, in a recent paper we wrote, we have this distinction between prohibitions and process. And so we talk about, like, minimum density rules and open space requirements and infrastructure requirements and kind of restrictions on density as being kind of the prohibition category of regulations, compared to like how hard it is to get a permit or how hard it is to get approval to build, or what you have to do in order to get a permit to build. I wonder, in your research in Argentina, kind of how you categorize land use regulations, and kind of where are they more restrictive? Which aspects of them are more restrictive?
Well, first of all, it depends on the cities, because we have, Argentina is a very big country. We have 28 states or provinces, but what we found is that all the processes, all the approval constant processes are really very important and matters a lot for development, and developers choose in which municipality they don't want at all to work, because it could take years to approve a plan or something like that.
Right.
That's one part of the story. But the other one is that, well, minimum size plots, for example, are quite important. We have for example, the province of Buenos Aires has a minimum size plot of 300 square meters, which is really a lot for bringing affordability to low income households. It's just too much. So people built informally three houses in the same plot, which is what they can afford. So
right. Yeah, I mean, then I was struck by that when I was doing some research on Argentina, because in Mexico, where I'm most familiar, but also I think in Brazil, like the typical size of a lot is 100 meters or 150 meters. And so when it's 350 meters is the minimum, that seems, and kind of like you were saying, it is the ambition of the planner that everyone has this much space.
Yes.
But the reality is people can afford
it. You cannot, yes, that's what happened. Planners want that the city is, everyone has a garden and everyone has a lot of space and green space, and that's not real at all. And what happens in the province of Buenos Aires, when this law was enacted, which was in 1970 and was there for almost 40 years or more, recently they are starting to change it, was that not only the minimum size plot was 300 square meters, but also the developer has to pay for the complete infrastructure. So what makes that is that the whole periphery of the cities, what you have is gated communities or neighborhoods that were catered to higher income households. No low income household can afford a plot in the formal market.
And then so that's something that I think Nora Libertun has written about, and how those gated communities don't necessarily appear in, they're kind of very selective about which municipalities in the periphery they work with. Is that also because of the regulations that different
Yes. Also because of the processes of
right.
How kind were the local governments to smooth the process and allow for changes from rural to urban use, which is another thing that it's very important in suburban development. Some municipalities were very strict and they don't want to change land uses, and other was, okay, just come here, we are going to do everything for you to build here.
Right. And so in terms of the kind of peripheral, the impact of land use regulations in the peripheral development, that's pretty clear that the minimum lot size is too high and the requirements and infrastructure are quite high. In the more central parts of the city, is there also restrictions on building multifamily housing, and does that kind of limit
Yes,
redevelopment opportunities?
you have areas in which there's low density. We have a very residential areas with very low density, which in fact, look, what makes is that city has to expand and to finance infrastructure in the extension. So I think that this is also an issue that happens in many cities in Argentina. But you have this issue that many homeowners in these areas, they don't want any construction there. They vote. This home voter hypothesis is really quite important there. People that vote with the value of their house, they don't want to change from that there, and the local governments, well, don't change the regulation because of that.
Sounds like a very familiar story.
I imagine.
In Santiago de Chile, they have had a bunch of upzoning programs. I wonder whether any governments in Argentina have seen that and got inspired to follow that, or is there not really a conversation about allowing higher density development?
No, we have our areas with high density but not in many cities. Not all that it's needed. That's the idea.
Okay, so I guess, and on the topic of informality, I mean, you mentioned kind of three housing units on one lot, where in theory the rules say there should only be one. That was something that when I did some research there, it was striking that in the municipalities with higher regulations or more restrictive regulations, prices were actually lower often, or there was this correlation between, it's the opposite of what happens in the US, where the more restrictive municipalities are the expensive ones. And what we kind of through correlations are suggesting, and your work has also suggested that, that's because there's more. So in these places where it's more restrictive, there's more of this informal housing, and kind of that's why, or that's connected to the prices being lower. Does that make sense? And kind of, what do you think about that relationship between regulations, informality, and prices?
I think that there is one issue that mediated on that, which is enforcement. I think that you have very strict or very high strict land use regulation, very tight, but at the other side, you cannot enforce that. So I think that when you have tight land use regulation, well, you can have more informality and lower pricing. But this is not the case in all parts, because in other parts you have tight land use regulation. We have greater amenities, and the value of housing is high. So
right, yeah. And on the enforcement question, is there? Is it corruption, or is it just lack of capacity? Kind of, maybe you can talk a little bit about how cities choose to enforce rule or not, and why.
Yes, we are starting a survey on enforcement on Latin American cities, because
oh, great.
Yes,
fantastic.
we are trying. It's a very difficult topic. Because we are doing research on land use regulation, and it's good. You can go and look at the plans and everything what they said. But well, what is happening with that in the real place? Are they enforcing it or not? So we are collecting information about land use regulation in many metropolitan areas, municipalities of metropolitan areas all over Latin America. But at the same time, we are planning to release a survey in social media or to planners and something like that, to collect information. Well, you have in the land use regulation of your city, you have a plan or that. Is the city enforcing it or not? Or in your regulation, you have what's called betterment levies to finance infrastructure. Is the municipality enforcing it or not? So, because we don't know much about enforcement, and we want to collect more information about well, what's happening. I think that many times, what I said before, plans are very rhetoric. They have all the good practices that you can find all over the world, but they lack capacity. They are not well suited to the local conditions. There are many, or they have oppositions. There are political economy reasons, the power of landowners or the powers of owners of land in the periphery. So you have a lot of things that make that can change the panorama in each city.
Those are really good points, and I'm very excited about that you're doing a survey on enforcement. I think it's going to be a challenge, right? I mean, I think gathering data on these things are very hard for a number of reasons. Maybe people don't want to talk about corruption as one reason, but also I think this question of changing rural to urban designation, that's the city council or the local government can just decide to do that, right? So when that's a discretionary process, then are they enforcing or not if they're very amenable to change? I mean, in this research we're doing on planning processes in Mexico, the plan isn't expected to stay the same from one period till it's updated 10 years later, right? It's just very common that in the 2010 plan, all this land is designated as agriculture or something, and then over the years the city council can just change on a case-by-case basis a plot's designation, right?
Yes.
And so it's an interesting thing because that's not enforcing a plan. I mean, that's not a lack of enforcement. It's just
change,
flexibility in the youth, right? Yes. So I think getting at that issue.
It's different to this. It's not easy to make the distinction between. Well, you need to be perhaps you need to be flexible to adapt, because many things are happening all the time. For example, now COVID-19. Well, you need to be flexible on what to do, but by the other side, the level of discretionality can be very high. And sometimes, but I think one of the most interesting things is that what we found, for example, by the study of land use regulation in Argentina, is that municipalities that have in their and enforce this type of what I call access to land related instruments, such as designing, allocating land for social housing, using land value capture tools to finance infrastructure, or this type of impact fees to they use impact fees or something like that, have lower informality and a high share of the population in formal housing. So those were positive for housing, for land and for housing. So what many times municipalities have all these type of instruments, but they don't enforce. So when we try to see, well, what's happening, well, they do have, but we want to collect information on what are they doing specifically about that.
Right. Yeah. So the distinction between having the instruments on the books versus actually using them.
Yes,
that's the challenge.
Yes.
And it's also an important point that I think that that I make in this course, that I think there's a lot of academic literature that criticizes overly restrictive land use regulations, like minimum lot sizes being too large, as a problem, but that doesn't mean that these people are advocating for total deregulation, right? I mean, I think there needs to be a very strong role of the local government. There needs to be strong regulation. It just needs to be adapted to the local conditions, and it needs to be carried out in a way that's promoting urbanization and promoting kind of housing construction, right, for people.
Sure, sure. We are doing other research about this land use regulation and enforcement, but we are using a database that we get about, well, what's happening globally with the way in which you enact your land use regulation and you enforce it. And we are finding that avoiding or not regulation, having cities with land without land use regulation is not good. You need land use regulation, but you need but what is needed, it's just what we need to find, no?
Right, right. Yeah, I wanted to ask also about this question that I think is common in a lot of countries where the land use regulations are used to prevent certain kinds of people from living in certain kinds of neighborhoods, right? So in the United States, we have a long history of racial segregation, and the Supreme Court made it illegal to segregate by race, and then local governments developed zoning in order to effectively, accomplish the same goals, essentially. And in Latin America, I think, my read is that a lot of cities maybe don't want to expand, and so they make it difficult to build housing, especially because the new people that were coming in the second half of the 20th century we were poorer people coming from the countryside oftentimes, and so kind of the city dwellers, didn't want them. I mean, that might not have been as strong of a trend in Argentina
Yes.
compared to other countries in Latin America. So maybe I wonder how the migration into cities in Argentina affects the use of land use regulations.
I think there are two ways. One is generally the size of the plots. If you have a municipality where the minimum size plot is 600 square meters, for example, which there are many of them in very in bordering the city of Buenos Aires, for example, well, you make that only people who can afford to pay this minimum consumption level will are going to live there. So that's one way. The other way is what you mentioned: cities not expanding, not providing infrastructure in many areas, and what you have is an informal market, people located in the periphery informally, without infrastructure and without everything over that. And that's our two different ways of excluding population. And what we found in another research project that in which I work is that those municipalities that have a higher share of homeowners of with high levels of education, with higher incomes, are the ones that have land use regulation more exclusive, no? In all this sense.
Right. Interesting. And is there a program to regularize? Are there programs to legalize the 3 houses on a plot kind of situation, or is that usually just ignored?
Well, no, but the main thing why they don't do that is because they say, well, since we don't have infrastructure, we don't have a water network, we don't have a sanitation, you cannot allow more than one house in a plot.
Right.
What they don't understand that people are willing to pay because they are paying more when they have to buy bottled water, when they get sick because they have poor sanitation and everything like that. So some cities are just implementing some type of betterment levy or something like that, in which people pay and the government provide the infrastructure and they can regularize all these places.
That's good. Makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, this has been a really good conversation. I think we covered all the things I wanted to talk about. I wonder, is there something we're missing? Something else we should know about your research or the topic of planning and land use regulations in Argentina?
Well, for many years, I have developed a very complete agenda on land use regulation in Argentina. I always say that I started working on that, and people were interested in housing, in transportation, in informal neighborhoods. Nobody was interested in land use regulation. And I think I was working in the less sexy subject in urban subjects. But now it's getting even more important. People are paying a lot of attention to this subject. So what I did is, well, I built, I do a lot of research in Argentina, and now I want to expand this research. So I get finance from the Lincoln Institute, and I'm doing this research that covers all Latin America. In particular, I'm trying to see what's the impact of land use regulation on informality. And why I do that? Because people always think that informality is an issue of poverty. And governments are usually focused on upgrading interventions, on land titling or anything like that. And what we have is, what we know from our research in Argentina is that land use regulation matters a lot on informality. So we are trying to change this view of what I say the programs that are curative programs related to informality to some that are preventive policies. So we are gathering information about how land use regulation is regulated all in these countries or in Latin America, and we are trying to see what's the impact on informality. Later, we want to see what happens with land prices and many other things. You know, you are a researcher, and you know that working on these subjects requires a lot of information. You don't have a database that say, well, you have all the database for all the cities in Latin America, use it. So this is a project of data collection, very important. And well, and we are involving also many public authorities, local authorities, national authorities in designing the project, in talking about this project, because we want not to be this a research project of academics that we write a paper and publish it, but we want to try to have more people involved in the discussion and everything. So that's the idea of the project, and well,
fantastic.
I'm working.
Yeah, I'm very excited about it. I mean, and like you say, it's becoming a more widely recognized topic for its importance, but it's an area where it takes a lot of data. There's a lot of work involved in generating enough data to actually have a robust analysis. So thank you for your service to the academic community and doing all that hard work. Because I'm sure people will be asking you, as soon as you have data, other researchers will be asking you to borrow it to do research.
Sure.
But yeah, and it is a topic where it should be engaged with governments, you know, because the idea is showing them how they can achieve goals in a way that they might not realize. But yeah, I mean, I think, and like you say, there's this tendency of blaming low-income neighborhoods, like blaming the people for the poor conditions of the neighborhood, when in fact, you know, it's the government's responsibility, and in many cases the government's fault that the poor conditions exist in the first place. So I think reframing it is important.
Yes. Because
and
if you think, for example, that informality is only determined by poverty, you only have social policies. You have more income transfers or something like that. But if you think that it's related to land use regulation, well, it's a matter for planners.
Right.
And
so this will be you'll have a data. I mean, there's going to be a website at some point, or how can we?
Yes,
okay.
we are planning to do that.
That's awesome.
I will call you many times about this, because I want your input too.
Great. Well, thanks again for recording an interview with me. I really appreciate it, and I think a lot of good stuff here.
Thank you. I was happy to talk with you. Bye-bye.
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 I'm just going to stop.